At 07:42 a.m., over the humid skies of New Guinea, the air vibrated with a low growl. Twin Bristol Hercules engines, straining as Flight Sergeant Alan Hawke Rivers shoved the throttle forward. The Beaufighter Mk6 lunged through cloud layers, its heavy frame trembling under the force. Below, Japanese Ki-21 Sally bombers crawled toward the Allied fuel dump near Oro Bay. "Target 11 o'clock low," came the voice of his observer, Sergeant Peter Lane. Rivers banked, sun flashing off the canopy, and brought the nose around. 4 Hispano mix-second 20mm cannons locked in a brutal stare. In one breath, the world became sound, a metal roar and a storm of shells. The first burst tore through the bomber's fuselage like a knife through silk. Rivers didn't watch it fall. He already saw the next. The Beaufighter. Beastfighter, the Germans had mocked, had just rewritten the rules of night and strike warfare. August 1942 brought cold winds to RAF Drem in Scotland, salt air cutting through canvas hangars where maintenance crews worked past midnight. Flight Sergeant Alan Rivers, 24 years old and grease-stained, tightened the last panel on a Hercules engine cowling. The Beaufighter stood before him, hulking and asymmetric, its nose scarred from recoil burns that no amount of paint could hide. Mechanics called it a brute, pilots who survived called it reliable. A young fitter named Collins stood beside Rivers, nodding at the 4 cannon barrels jutting from the aircraft's nose. "Bit of overkill in it," Rivers only smirked, pulling his work gloves tighter. "Overkill's what keeps bombers from coming back." The Beaufighter's armament represented a calculated gamble by Bristol Aeroplane Company engineers. 4 20mm Hispano cannons had been salvaged from Spitfire designs and doubled in the Beaufighter's nose, fed by ammunition drums that jammed under pressure and vibration. Each jam meant death on the next sortie. Rivers knew this intimately. He'd watched 2 crews vanish into the North Sea after their guns froze mid-engagement. Tonight's mission called for night interception over the northern approaches. Their AI Mk4 radar barely functioned in coastal fog, yet command wanted results. Rivers tugged his flight gloves on, checked the arming switches one final time. "Let's make the heavy twins sing," he said quietly. At 23:18 hours that same night, Rivers scanned the faint green pulse of the radar tube. Static washed across the scope in waves. Then a flicker appeared, faint but distinct. "Contact, range 4 miles, Lane said, his breath fogging in the unheated cockpit. The Beaufighter sliced through black sky at 6,000 feet, invisible to the bombers it hunted. The radar guided them closer, the oscilloscope showing the target's drift southward. At 2 miles, Rivers reduced throttle, letting the bomber pull slightly ahead. At 6,000 feet, they saw it. A Heinkel He-111 limping home from a raid on Hull. One engine trailed smoke, the pilot likely exhausted. Rivers steadied his hand on the firing button, lined up the gun sight reticle. "Steady, wait for it," he whispered. The cannons opened with a volcanic growl, 240 rounds per minute per barrel, spewing from the nose. The first burst lit the night like a flashbulb, tearing through the Heinkel's left engine nacelle and wing root. Rivers banked hard right, debris grazing the Beaufighter's fuselage with metallic pings. Lane shouted over the intercom, "Hit confirmed. He's going down." They circled once, watching the orange bloom blossom against the black water below. Rivers' voice was quiet, almost conversational. "That's one less hitting London tonight." Back at base, they logged the kill at 23:29 hours, confirmed by radar plot and visual observation. But the technical officer frowned at the spent casings scattered across the hangar floor. "Overheated feed trays again," he muttered, examining the warped metal links. "If that jams mid-pass, you're a dead man, Rivers." Rivers only said, "Then fix it before tomorrow night." At Bristol Aeroplane Company's Filton facility in September 1942, Chief Armament Engineer Harold Penrose stared at a row of jammed Hispano cannon drums laid across his workbench like mechanical corpses. Each drum showed identical stress fractures along the feed pole housing. "They're cooking off under recoil," he muttered, running calculations on a notepad. The Beaufighter's nose vibration exceeded Spitfire tolerances by 40% due to the aircraft's heavier mass and twin-engine torque. His assistant, a young engineer named Morris, frowned at the numbers. "So what do we do? Reduce the firing rate?" Penrose rubbed his temples, staring at the damaged components. "We rebuild the feed system entirely. Wider ammunition belts, improved solenoid trigger mechanisms, and hydraulic dampers for recoil absorption." 3 weeks later, Rivers' Beaufighter at RAF Drem received the prototype modification kit. Ground crews expressed doubt during installation, remembering previous failed attempts. The first test fire came on a cold October morning. The plane chocked and anchored. Rivers pressed the firing button. The Beaufighter shuddered violently, a roar that shook the hangar walls and sent mechanics stumbling back. But not a single jam occurred across 400 rounds. Rivers climbed down, grinning wide. "Feels like she's angry now," he said. By late 1942, the Beaufighter had evolved from purely night hunter to daylight strike aircraft, faster and deadlier with each modification. Its cannons no longer jammed. They shredded targets with mechanical efficiency. Yet Luftwaffe intelligence reports still worried command. One captured document sneered, "Heavy and slow, limited maneuverability." Rivers read it aloud in the mess hall and laughed hard. "Then let's show them exactly how slow kills," he said. January 1943 brought Rivers' squadron to Port Moresby, New Guinea, where humidity clung to every surface and engines overheated before takeoff. No longer chasing Heinkels over Britain, they now hunted Japanese bombers, threatening the supply lines that sustained the Pacific campaign. The Beaufighter Makiusk stood ready on the pierced steel planking, tropical air filters installed, twin 20mm cannons under the nose, supplemented by 6.303 Brownings in the wings. The briefing room buzzed with nervous chatter that January morning. "Enemy formation heading from Rabaul, expected over Huon Gulf within the hour," the intelligence officer announced. Rivers nodded to Lane and the rest of his crew. "We're going to punch holes where they least expect us." Takeoff was chaos. Dust clouds, engine noise, sweat already soaking through flight suits. At 4,000 feet, turbulence hit hard, tropical thermals throwing the heavy aircraft around. Lane's voice crackled through the intercom. "Two contacts, Kai-49 Donru bombers, high formation at 11 o'clock. Rivers adjusted trim, easing the nose down into attack position. "Let's make this count." At 200 yards, he fired. The cannons howled, shells ripping the nearest bomber apart in seconds. Its wing folded like paper, the aircraft tumbling into cloud. Another burst followed immediately. The second target shredded before its pilot could react. The radio buzzed with disbelief from other pilots. "Christ, Hawk, 1 pass and 2 kills," he replied calmly, checking his ammunition counter. The cannons finally worked properly. The after-action report that afternoon noted, 2 enemy bombers destroyed. Ammunition expenditure, 180 rounds total, no friendly casualties. Command began paying attention to the Beaufighter's strike capability in tropical theaters. Under a corrugated metal shelter at Oro Bay, ground crews fought their own war against mud, malaria, and relentless rust. Corporal James Sparks Heller leaned over a stripped Beaufighter nose assembly, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Sans chewing through the feed chutes again," he reported to Rivers, who'd come to inspect the damage. Rivers crouched beside him, examining the abraded metal surfaces. "Can we reinforce them with anything we've got?" Sparks pointed to a crate of salvaged Spitfire parts recently arrived from Australia. "We can repurpose these guide sleeves, cut and weld them to fit the Beaufighter feed system." Rivers nodded. "Do it. We fly tomorrow morning." 3 hours later, with improvised arc welding equipment powered by a captured Japanese generator, they completed the modification. Rivers ran another test burst that evening. The guns spat perfect rhythm, brass casings ejecting cleanly. Sparks whooped, punching the air. "Looks like your girl's ready for another dance." The ingenuity spread through the squadron within weeks. Field modifications became informal doctrine, documented in maintenance logs that eventually reached Bristol engineers in England. One engineering report from April 1943 noted, "Improvised tropical gun feed sleeves, developed in theatre, show marked effectiveness against sand abrasion and heat-induced jamming. Recommend adoption fleet-wide." Every sortie now hit harder and faster, but fatigue gnawed at the crews. Sleep came in 2-hour shifts between missions, mosquitoes humming louder than the distant engines. Rivers kept his personal log entries short and factual. 17 January, 3 sorties, ammunition performance excellent. 18 January, 2 sorties, Lane sick with fever. 19th January, stand down for maintenance. Then, in smaller writing, "We hold. The guns hold. The men hold. Barely. The night mission launched at 02 per 10 hours under overcast skies, visibility poor and worsening. Weather reports predicted deterioration, but the objective couldn't wait. Disrupt a Japanese convoy moving supplies off lay under cover of darkness. Rivers flew low, maintaining 50 feet over the water, every wave crest shimmering silver under the cloud-filtered moon. The radar flickered unreliably, static swallowing their electronic senses. "Contact ahead, 4 ships, range 2 miles, Lane called out, squinting at the scope. Rivers climbed to 200 feet for the attack run, lined up on the lead freighter silhouetted against the darker ocean. The 20mm cannons thundered, tracers slashing through darkness like angry fireflies. Explosions rippled across the deck, secondary detonations suggesting ammunition or fuel stores hit. Lane shouted over the roar, "Direct hit on the bridge structure." Anti-aircraft fire erupted instantly, orange bursts cutting the sky into geometric patterns. One shell clipped their right wingtip, metal shrieking. "Hold her steady," Rivers barked, the control stick vibrating violently in his hand. Smoke filled the cockpit, acrid and choking. They limped home on one engine after the right motor seized, landing with hydraulic fluid hissing from punctured lines. Rivers climbed out, coughing, half laughing from exhaustion and relief. "Heavy and slow, my ass," he muttered. Next morning's intelligence report read, "Convoy 18, 2 ships destroyed, 1 damaged, estimated 800 tons supplies lost." A margin note in different handwriting added, "Weapon effectiveness assessment, 20mm Hispano cannons rated devastating against maritime targets." 3 days later, a captured Japanese radio intercept reached Allied intelligence. "Beware the twin-engine whispering death. Approaches without sound from darkness. Kills in seconds." Rivers read the translation and allowed himself a tired smile. At the same time, in February 1943, German intelligence reports circulated through Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin. One assessment, later captured in Tunisia, stated bluntly, "Bristol Beaufighter, limited agility, underpowered for its weight class. Recommendation: avoid head-on engagement where cannons become lethal. Exploit vertical maneuvers. Rivers read both translations during a rare mail call and felt quiet satisfaction. In the air, reality proved harsher than intelligence summaries suggested. Fuel shortages plagued the squadron, worn gun barrels, reduced accuracy, and rising losses haunted every briefing. They'd lost 3 crews in February alone. One dawn, Rivers found Sparks asleep beside a dismantled engine, tools still in his hands. Instead of waking him, Rivers covered him with a canvas tarp. "He's earned the rest," he whispered to another mechanic. The war ground forward relentlessly. Each flight blurred into another. Jungle heat, sudden fire, endless metal fatigue, slowly accumulating in aircraft and men alike. Maintenance logs showed increasing stress cracks. Engine overhauls needed every 150 hours instead of the rated 300. Yet the Beaufighter endured. It wasn't speed that won these engagements, it was concentrated firepower applied with precision. In March, Rivers flew 21 sorties, Lane beside him on 19 of them. Their aircraft took damage 7 times, but always returned. The armourers painted small bomb symbols on the fuselage nose, marking confirmed kills. By month's end, the count reached 14. Other crews watched with mixture of admiration and concern. "You're pushing too hard, Hawk," one pilot said quietly. Rivers just shrugged, checking his flight schedule. "The Japs aren't taking breaks, neither can we." That week a new operation order arrived, Operation Quickstep, target Rabaul Harbour. Rivers read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his logbook. Operation Quickstep launched March 18, 1943, targeting Rabaul Harbour, the hub of Japanese logistics for the entire Solomon Islands campaign. Weather reports showed a storm front approaching from the east, but command deemed the window acceptable. 6 Beaufighters took off in formation at dawn, skimming sea foam to avoid radar detection. Rivers led the strike element. "Stay low, stay loud, get out fast," he briefed over radio. At the harbour mouth, the sky exploded with tracers. Anti-aircraft batteries had been reinforced after previous raids, creating interlocking fields of fire. Rivers pressed the trigger, the Beaufighter roaring like an angry god. Cannons smashed through concrete emplacements, leaving nothing but fire and shattered steel. A near miss rocked them hard, cockpit glass shattering, Lane bleeding from a cheek cut. "Hold it together," Rivers shouted, pulling into a climbing turn. Behind them, plumes of smoke rose from the docks, secondary explosions rippling through fuel dumps. 2 Beaufighters didn't make it out. Rivers saw one spiral into the harbour, trailing flame. The after-action report, filed that afternoon, read, "Beaufighter squadron neutralised 5 defensive positions in under 2 minutes. Losses, 2 aircraft, 4 crew members missing, presumed killed. Enemy losses, unknown, presumed high, based on observed damage." A statistical analysis attached later noted, strike efficiency ratio, 2.5 defensive positions destroyed per aircraft lost. The Germans might have called the Beaufighter slow, but to the men who witnessed its concentrated fire, the effect was apocalyptic. Rivers attended the memorial service that evening for the lost crews, standing silent while chaplains read names. Afterward, he walked back to his aircraft alone. Sparks was already there, patching bullet holes. Neither spoke. They both understood the mathematics of attrition, the brutal calculus that governed their survival. April 3, 1943 brought new sorties and familiar weight, but that day something changed in ways the pre-flight checklist couldn't predict. Mid-attack on a Japanese supply column, one cannon jammed, right feed line failure. The recoil from the remaining 3 guns kicked the nose sideways violently, nearly rolling the aircraft inverted. Rivers fought the control stick with both hands, muscles straining. "She's gone heavy on the right side." Lane recalibrated trim desperately, shouting over the noise of airframe stress. "We can't stay in formation like this." They broke off, immediately hunted by two Ki-43 Oscar fighters that had been providing top cover. Rivers dove into cloud cover, heart hammering, the Beaufighter shuddering under the strain. For 30 seconds, they vanished into white nothing, alone, blind, trusting instruments, while enemy fighters circled above. Then a gap in the clouds appeared ahead. Rivers saw the sea again, endless blue stretching to the horizon. Lane rearmed the remaining cannons manually, forcing the feed mechanism. 3 guns left, make them count. Rivers flipped the master arming switch, breathed once deeply. The first Oscar dove through the cloud gap, tracers stitching the air. He fired a burst, 120 rounds in 2 seconds. The fighter disintegrated mid-turn, wings separating from fuselage. The second Oscar pilot saw this and broke away hard, disappearing into cloud. Rivers exhaled slowly. "Heavy and slow, huh? Not dead yet." They nursed the damaged aircraft back to Oro Bay, landing with 1 gun still jammed solid. Sparks examined it afterward, finding the feed Powell fused to its housing by heat stress. He tagged it with chalk. "Battle Honor. Rabaul Strike Survivor." The gun was removed and sent back to Bristol with detailed failure analysis. Penrose would see it 3 months later and redesign the entire feed system again. At Filton in June 1943, Harold Penrose read the latest field reports spread across his desk. One line caught his attention. "Feed line fracture after 240 continuous rounds fired in tropical conditions." He scrawled a note in the margin. "Requires vibration dampened link. Design, Mach 3rd, recoil sleeve with improved heat dissipation." The Beaufighter's evolution had become his obsession, consuming 18-hour workdays. He met with Bristol engineers, drafting modifications, automatic fire cutoffs to prevent thermal runaway, improved cooling ducts routing air through the cannon bay, redesigned ammunition links with greater flexibility. By late June, the MKX prototype emerged from the experimental hangar. Faster Hercules anticipative engines provided 1,170 horsepower each, increased fuel capacity, extended range to 1,540 miles, and reinforced cannon bays incorporated every lesson learned from Pacific combat. When Rivers returned to England in July for briefings on new tactics, Penrose greeted him personally at the airfield. "You've been breaking my machines faster than we can build them," the engineer said with a slight smile. Rivers grinned back. "Then build them faster." They walked through the production hangar together, rows of Beaufighters gleaming under floodlights, each one incorporating modifications born from combat experience. Penrose placed a hand on one fuselage, feeling the cool aluminum. "Every modification you field tested in New Guinea saved lives here. That recoil modification preventing feed line fractures, that's yours, based on your maintenance logs." Rivers didn't reply immediately. He was already staring at the next serial number being stenciled on a tail section, thinking about the crews who would fly it. The war wasn't slowing down. Production figures showed 364 Beaufighters delivered in 1943 alone, each one slightly better than the last. Neither engineers nor pilots would stop improving until the fighting ended. Penrose handed Rivers a technical manual, freshly printed. "MKX flight characteristics. Read it tonight. You're testing her tomorrow morning." August 1943 brought Rivers to the Solomon Islands for his final mission rotation before returning stateside. The objective: intercept enemy bombers near Bougainville before they reached the newly constructed airstrip at Torokina. Radio crackle at 14:30 hours. Multiple Betty bombers inbound, altitude 6,000 feet, bearing 270. Rivers led the four-plane formation into a climbing turn. Let's give them one clean pass, no second chances. He rolled inverted at 7,000 feet, dropped behind the enemy formation with practiced precision, and aligned his gun sight on the trailing bomber. He fired. The Beaufighter trembled as cannons spewed fire, the distinctive sound now familiar as breathing. The first bomber erupted, left wing separating, debris raining over the jungle canopy below. Lane shouted over the intercom, "They're breaking formation." Rivers, tracked left, fired again. The second burst shredded another Betty, cockpit disintegrating in the hail of 20mm shells. The third Japanese pilot panicked, veering too sharply while watching his wingmen die. He collided mid-air with another bomber, both aircraft merging in a fireball that briefly outshone the sun. Rivers pulled up hard, canopy fogged from sweat and stress. Lane's laughter filled the intercom, slightly hysterical. 3 in 1 run. I told you she's angry now. Rivers only said, "Let's go home before she cools off," already thinking about fuel remaining and distance to base. The mission log filed that evening read, "Enemy formation destroyed, 4 aircraft confirmed, Beaufighter performance exemplary, ammunition expenditure 340 rounds." A separate intelligence assessment noted, "Enemy bombing raid completely disrupted, no damage to Torquino airfield." Penrose's final engineering note that month, written in Bristol, read, "Operational perfection achieved through iterative field modification and crew adaptation under combat stress. Recommend no further major changes to MKX design." The Beaufighter had become what it needed to be. Not beautiful, not fast, but devastatingly effective at its purpose. The post-war years brought silence to Filton Aerodrome. In 1946, rows of retired Beaufighters sat dormant on hardstands, moss creeping over their wings, paint peeling from fuselages exposed to English weather. Rivers walked among them in civilian clothes, now a test pilot for Bristol evaluating new designs. His hand brushed the weathered fuselage of his old aircraft, the one he'd flown 37 missions in. The paint had faded to unrecognizable colors, the 4 cannon ports empty and dark. Sparks, older now but still grinning, joined him on the tarmac. "They're scrapping her next week," he said quietly. "Sending most of them to the smelters?" Rivers nodded slowly. "She did her job. More than anyone expected." He paused, eyes lingering on the empty gun ports where so much fire had poured. "Funny thing. Intelligence called her heavy, slow, underpowered. But she carried every one of us home when it mattered." Harold Penrose appeared, walking carefully across the uneven concrete, holding a framed photograph. It showed a Beaufighter squadron at Oro Bay in 1943, crews standing in front of their aircraft, young and lean and alive. "Never forget what you proved there," Penrose said, his voice carrying decades of engineering battles. "Power doesn't need speed when you have resolve and precision." The 3 men stood silently for several minutes, watching the afternoon light fade across the abandoned aircraft. The engines would never roar again. The cannons would never fire. But in archives scattered across Britain, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, her name endured in mission reports, maintenance logs, and intelligence assessments. The Japanese had called her Whispering Death. The Germans had warned against her. The crews who flew her simply called her reliable. That was enough. Decades later, visitors to the RAF Museum at Hendon stopped before a restored Beaufighter MKX, its dark green paint gleaming under carefully positioned lights. The placard mounted beside it read, "Bristol Beaufighter, armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6.303 Browning machine guns. Maximum speed 330 mph apiece, range 1,440 miles. Known to Allied pilots as the Beaufighter, to enemy forces as Whispering Death. Operational service 1940 through 1945, produced in 5,228 units. A recorded voice played through ceiling-mounted speakers, archival audio crackling with the texture of old magnetic tape. It was heavy, certainly. It was slow compared to fighters, but it always came back with the job done, and that's what mattered. In the end, the attribution read, Flight Sergeant A. Rivers, Mission Debrief Transcript, August 1943. The museum lights dimmed on schedule at closing time, reflecting off the aircraft's dark green skin. Somewhere in that quiet space, the echo of twin Hercules engines seemed to hum faintly. The ghost of a machine built not for elegance or speed, but for survival and lethality under impossible conditions. The Beaufighter's legacy lived on in the silence between wars, in the engineering principles that refused to accept defeat, in the mechanics who improvised solutions under jungle canopies, and in the pilots who aimed not for glory, but simply for home. Production records showed 5,128 aircraft delivered between 1940 and 1945. Combat reports documented thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, hundreds of ships sunk, countless ground targets neutralized. But the real measure lived in quieter statistics: crews who completed full tours, innovations born from necessity, and the knowledge that sometimes the answer to impossible problems was simply concentrated firepower applied with precision. The Beaufighter wasn't the fastest, wasn't the prettiest, wasn't the one that captured public imagination. It was simply the one that worked when it mattered most.